Close your eyes, dear listener. Let the noise of the day melt away. Allow each breath to slow, like a soft breeze drifting through ancient ruins. Tonight, we set sail to a Dracula, Shadows of the Carpathians. The carriage moved slowly, wheels murmuring over the old stone road. Above, the mountains rose like sleeping giants, their shoulders draped in silver mist. The air was cool and clean, tinged with the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. Somewhere far below, a river wound its way between dark valleys, its surface catching the last light of the day like a thread of molten gold. The traveler, no longer certain how many days the journey had taken, watched the world pass in a soft blur. Each turn of the road revealed something new. A field scattered with haystacks, their rounded forms glowing faintly in the dusk. A cluster of cottages with thatched roofs, leaning close as though sharing secrets. The pale walls of a church, its steeple pointing like a finger toward the first evening star. The driver said little. Now and then he would glance back with a faint nod, as if to reassure the traveler that the path ahead was known, even if it seemed to vanish into shadow. The horses, dark and steady, moved with the patient rhythm of creatures long accustomed to these winding ways. Somewhere beyond those ridges lay Transylvania, an ancient name, whispered in stories told by fireside. It was a land caught between worlds, between the rising sun of the east and the long shadows of the west, between the living and the dead, if one believed the old tales. The road narrowed, climbing higher. The forest closed in, the trees standing so close that their branches knit together overhead, weaving a roof of black lace against the fading sky. The sound of the wheels grew muffled on the soft earth, and the air was filled with the deep, resinous perfume of the pines. Through a gap in the trees, the traveler caught a glimpse of a distant peak, its crown still lit with the last fire of the sunset, while the slopes below were already folding into night. Somewhere out there, hidden among those folds of darkness, rose the walls of an ancient fortress. Some called it a castle, others called it something else entirely. A village appeared at the edge of the road, its small windows glowing amber in the gloom. The carriage slowed as it passed between the houses. Old women sat on low benches by their doors, their hands resting in their laps, their eyes following the strangers passing with unreadable expressions. Children paused in their play, watching silently until the carriage had gone. At the far end of the village stood a wooden post marked with strange symbols carved deep into the grain. The driver touched his hat as they passed it, as if in respect, or perhaps in warning. Night settled fully now. The moon rose pale and watchful, casting a silver sheen over the path. An owl called from somewhere high in the dark canopy, and its echo followed them for a long while. The traveler drew the cloak closer around their shoulders, feeling the cooled breath of the mountain night. Ahead, the road curved toward a ridge where the trees fell away and the land opened in a wide sweep. The driver's voice came at last, low and careful, as if it might be overheard by something in the dark. "Beyond this pass, the land belongs to him." He did not need to say the name. In this place, the name was more often left unspoken. The carriage pressed on into the shadowed heights, carrying its lone passenger toward the heart of the Carpathians, and the beginning of a story that would not end with dawn. The fire in the great hall burned low, its flames casting long, wavering shadows upon the carved stone walls. Our narrator's voice softened, as though inviting you to lean in, to hear the quiet threads of a tale that began centuries before the moonlit night we find ourselves in now. To understand the count, the voice murmured, you must first understand the man. In the 15th century, when the world felt both larger and more perilous than it does now, there was a land called Wallachia. It lay cradled between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube River, a place of deep forests, misted valleys, and roads so narrow that two riders could not pass without one stepping aside. Here, the winters were long and biting, the summers brief and filled with the buzzing of insects and the fragrance of wildflowers. It was a land often caught between greater powers, the Ottoman Empire to the south, Hungary to the west, and the restless principalities beyond the mountains to the north. Wallachia was not a place of peace, but of survival. It was in this crucible that Vlad III was born. History remembers him by many names: Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, and most famously, through the tangled roots of legend, Dracula. The name Dracula did not, at first, mean what it would come to mean in the candlelit imaginations of later centuries. It came from his father, Vlad II Dracul, a member of the Order of the Dragon, a knightly society sworn to defend Christendom against the advancing Ottomans. Dracul meant dragon in the Old Tongue, and so the son was Dracula, son of the dragon. Vlad's childhood was shaped by shadows and by iron. When he was still a boy, he and his younger brother Radu were sent as hostages to the Ottoman court, not as prisoners in chains, but as guarantees of his father's loyalty. It was a gilded captivity, rich silks, jeweled halls, fine food, and yet always the sense of being watched, weighed, and held in the palm of a power far larger than himself. There, in the corridors of the Ottoman palace, Vlad learned the arts of war, diplomacy, and survival. He learned their language, their customs. But he also learned mistrust. For in those days, an oath was often broken before the ink of the signature had dried. When he returned to Wallachia as a young man, the land was not waiting with open arms. It was scarred by constant wars, its throne contested by rival claimants, each backed by either Ottoman gold or Hungarian steel. Vlad's rise to power was neither gentle nor simple. 3 times he would take the throne, and each time it would cost him blood, his enemies, and often his own mans. And here the story begins to split into 2 streams, one that history records, and one that the people whispered by firelight. The history books tell of a ruler both ruthless and disciplined. Vlad fought to keep his small principality free from the grip of the Ottomans, even as he sparred with Hungarian intrigue. He fortified borders, punished treachery without hesitation, and demanded loyalty above all else. But the whispers tell of his punishments in detail. They tell of stakes driven into the earth and enemies left upon them like terrible scarecrows, a grim warning to any who would threaten his rule. The chronicles say that once an Ottoman envoy refused to remove his turban before Vlad. So, Vlad had it nailed to the man's head, a gesture both horrifying and symbolic. Whether these tales were truth, exaggeration, or crafted entirely by his enemies, no one can say for certain. But the fear they inspired spread like smoke over the mountains. Still, to his supporters, Vlad was a defender, a wall of iron against the empire that threatened to sweep away their homes, their fields, their churches. They saw him as a prince who kept the roads safe from bandits, who punished the corrupt, who made certain that even the poorest peasant could travel without fear. But the West heard the darker stories, and those stories traveled farther than the truth. It is here, the narrator's voice slowed, that myth begins to sink its roots into history. For long after Vlad's bones had returned to the earth, the name Dracula would not rest in peace. It would grow, like ivy climbing the walls of a long-forgotten tower, until it wound its way into the mind of an Irish writer centuries later, a man named Bram Stoker. And through his pen, the stern Prince of Wallachia would be reborn, not as a man, but as a creature of the night. The fire crackled in the great hall. Outside, a soft wind pressed against the shutters. The narrator's voice lowered still further. But that, they said, is a tale best told on a night such as this, when the moon rides high and the mountains hold their breath. The road had been climbing for hours. It wound like a dark ribbon through the Carpathian mountains, its edges frayed by the sheer drop of the valleys below. Pine forests crowded close, their tops swaying gently against a pale, ghostly sky. The carriage wheels creaked, slow and steady, as though in no hurry to reach its destination. From time to time, the horses snorted, their breath rising in clouds that hung in the cold evening air. The narrator, our traveler, sat wrapped in a heavy cloak, watching the world narrow into shadow. They had read of these mountains, of the stories whispered in the villages below, but nothing had prepared them for the stillness here. It was not the stillness of peace, but of a place holding its breath. Somewhere far off, a wolf's call rose and fell, its echo shivering across the slopes. The coachman crossed himself quietly and flicked the reins. The sun was gone now, replaced by a moon swollen and silver. Its light fell in narrow shafts through the tall trees, painting the road in pale stripes. The air smelled of resin and frost, and beneath that, something faint, like the cold metal scent of rain yet to come. At last, through the gap in the forest, they saw it. The castle. It rose from a crag of black rock, its towers like the teeth of some vast ancient creature. No warm lanterns lit its windows, yet it seemed awake, as though it had been expecting them. Stone walls climbed straight from the cliff's edge, their faces worn by centuries of wind and snow. The carriage climbed the final slope. Hooves struck sparks from the cobblestones of the outer courtyard. The gates stood open, wide enough for the carriage to pass without pause, and no guards were in sight. The travelers stepped down, boots crunching on the frost that clung to the stones. The air here was colder, thinner, as though it had been sealed away from the valleys below. From the shadow of the great doorway, a figure emerged. Tall, clad in black that seemed to drink the moonlight. The face pale, the eyes dark and steady, studying the traveler not with suspicion, but with a quiet, unsettling curiosity. "Welcome," the man said, his voice low and even, with an accent shaped by centuries. "You have come far." The traveler nodded, finding words unnecessary. There was something in the way he spoke, as if the syllables themselves carried weight. Inside, the castle was not the ruin they had expected. The walls, though ancient, were clean and hung with heavy tapestries whose colors had faded to the deep, muted tones of old wine and dusk. The floors shone in the candlelight, and the ceilings arched high overhead, carved with patterns whose meanings had long since been forgotten. The Count moved with unhurried grace, leading the traveler through halls where the sound of their footsteps seemed swallowed by the stone. There were portraits on the walls, Stern men and solemn women, their faces painted in the style of centuries past. The eyes in those paintings seemed to follow, their gazes lingering as the pair passed. At last, they came to a chamber where a fire burned low in a vast hearth. The chairs were deep and comfortable, drawn close to the warmth. On the table beside them, a decanter of dark wine glowed in the flicker of the flames. "Sit," the Count said softly. "You must be tired from your journey." The traveler sank into the chair, feeling the fire's heat seep slowly into their bones. The Count poured the wine, its color rich as garnets, and placed the glass in their hand. They drank, and the warmth spread. The fire crackled, the shadows shifted, and outside the wind moved around the high walls like a living thing. The Count spoke, not of himself, not yet, but of the mountains, the seasons, the history of the land. As he talked, the traveler's eyes grew heavy. The voice was steady, deep, almost lulling, a sound that seemed to reach past the waking mind into the slow rhythm of dreams. Somewhere far away, a door closed, a lock clicked, and yet there was no fear, only the quiet sense of being where one was meant to be, for now. Outside, the wolves called again, and inside, in the glow of the fire, the night deepened around them. The traveler woke up to the sound of silence. It was not the hush of an empty room, but the kind of stillness that feels shaped, as though every object in the space has chosen its place and then held its breath. The fire from the night before had burned to soft embers. Gray light seeped in through the tall windows, its touch faint and cold. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck, a single low chime. When the Count appeared, he seemed not to have slept at all. His clothes were the same, yet unwrinkled, his posture unchanged. In his hand, he held a small silver key. "You may wish to see the library," he said, as though the thought had only just occurred. "Many of my guests have found interesting things there." The traveler followed him through the stone corridors. Their steps echoed faintly, then faded into the deep stillness again. Along the way, they passed doors carved with symbols older than the castle itself. The library door was tall, its wood darkened by age, its surface smooth as bone. The Count unlocked it with a slow, deliberate turn of the key. The hinges moved without sound, and the scent of paper and time spilled into the hall. The room was vast. Shelves climbed from floor to ceiling, heavy with leather-bound volumes whose spines bore titles in Latin, Greek, and scripts the traveler could not name. High above, narrow windows admitted thin blades of daylight, dust swirling in their beams. The Count gestured toward the shelves. "Here," he said quietly, "are the stories that have not yet died." The traveler wandered among the books, fingertips trailing over cracked leather. Some titles were familiar, chronicles of kings, accounts of wars long past, but others seemed to almost hum beneath the touch, as though the words inside were awake. One book lay open on a table near the far wall. Its pages were thick and yellowed, the ink faded to the brown of dried leaves. The illustrations were precise, showing fortresses, battlefields, and men in armor, one figure appearing again and again, his face stern beneath a crown-like helm. "That," the Count's voice came softly from behind, "is my family's history, or so it is said." He spoke then of a prince, not a king, not a tyrant, but something in between. A man who had defended his land against invaders with such ferocity that his name became a curse on the lips of his enemies. A man who fought not for gold, but for the soil beneath his feet, for the rivers and forests that had fed his people for generations. They called him Vlad Dracul, the dragon, and later Dracula, son of the dragon. The traveler listened, the fire in the hearth whispering softly behind them. The Count's words were not hurried. They moved like water down a slow river, carrying images of castles under siege, of banners snapping in the wind, of nights lit by the glow of distant fires. But, the Count continued, history is a fragile thing. It can be broken, bent, reshaped, until the truth no longer fits inside it. He closed the book gently, his pale fingers resting on the cover as though feeling its pulse. My ancestor was a man of his time, yet men remember what they fear longer than they remember what they love. The traveler glanced around the shelves again. Among the rows of books, a few spaces stood empty, as if certain volumes had been removed, perhaps hidden. The absence seemed deliberate, the gaps too purposeful to be chance. Before they could ask, the Count turned toward the door. "Come," he said. "There are other rooms you may wish to see, and perhaps other truths." In the hall, the air felt cooler. The wind outside pressed against the windows, making them tremble faintly in their frames. The traveler followed the Count deeper into the castle, the library door closing softly behind them, taking with it the scent of paper and the weight of centuries. The traveler had grown used to the castle's strange quiet, but the room they entered now was not silent. It breathed. The banquet hall was long and high, lit not by candles, but by tall oil lamps whose flames swayed in some unseen draught. Their light painted the stone walls gold, then faded into the shadows that pooled in the rafters. A table stretched almost the full length of the room. It was set for two. Silver plates gleamed in the lamplight, polished so perfectly that the traveler expected to see their own reflection, but the surfaces showed nothing but a pale blur. The goblets, too, shone, without image. At the far end of the hall, a great tapestry hung, a battle scene frozen in threads of crimson, gold, and black. It showed a mounted warrior, sword raised, a host of enemies falling before him. The same stern face from the library illustrations looked out from beneath the helm. "Please," the Count said, gesturing toward the nearer chair, "I would be honored if you would dine with me." The traveler sat. The chair was carved with intricate knots in vines, the wood warm beneath the hands. When the Count took his seat opposite, the oil lamps seemed to burn a little brighter, though the flames did not grow. A door at the side opened silently, and a servant appeared, thin, pale, eyes cast downward. Without a word, they set dishes on the table: dark bread, roasted meat fragrant with herbs, and a bowl of something red and steaming. The traveler ate cautiously at first, but the food was rich and warm, the kind that sinks into the bones and eases the mind. The Count, however, only lifted his goblet now and then, drinking slowly from its deep red contents. "You must forgive me," he said with a faint smile. "My tastes are particular." As they ate, the Count spoke of lands far to the east, of mountain passes where the wind howled like wolves, of rivers that glowed under the moonlight as if lit from within. Some tales sounded like history, others like the stories one tells children to keep them close to the hearth at night. He spoke of men who vanished in the snow, only to be found standing days later, eyes wide and empty. Of villages that heard the sound of a single knock on every door at midnight, and where no one answered, no one survived till dawn. The traveler listened, the warmth of the food battling a strange chill that crept into their thoughts. There was no clock in the hall, but time seemed to stretch, as though the meal had lasted hours, and yet only minutes. When the plates were cleared, the Count leaned back in his chair, studying his guest. "There are truths in this world," he said softly, "that are not meant to be believed, only remembered." He rose then, and the traveler noticed something they had not before. For all the light in the room, the Count's shadow did not seem to fall in the same direction as the lamps. The servant returned, carrying a silver dish covered by a lid. When it was set before the traveler, they hesitated before lifting it. Inside was not food, but a single key, old, heavy, its surface blackened with age. The Count's voice was quiet, almost lost beneath the faint hiss of the oil lamps. "There is a door in the north wing," he said. "This will open it. What you choose to do after that will be your own story." And then, without another word, he turned and left the hall. The oil flames flickered in his wake, and for a moment, the room felt entirely empty, as though the warmth had been drawn away with him. The travelers sat alone, the old key cold in their hand. The key felt heavier the longer the traveler held it. Its teeth were uneven, as if it had been cut by hand centuries ago. The metal was cold, even in the warmth of the banquet hall, and there was a faint smell of iron about it, old iron, like the inside of a closed chest. They left the table slowly, the echo of their footsteps following them across the hall. The oil lamps burned steady, but the light seemed to thin near the edges of the room, as though it were reluctant to touch the walls. The corridor beyond the banquet hall was narrow and unlit. The traveler passed stone alcoves where suits of armor stood in silent ranks. Some were polished and whole. Others were missing pieces, a gauntlet here, a breastplate there, as though someone had taken what they needed and left the rest to gather dust. The further they went, the cooler the air became. It smelled faintly of pine resin, as though the forest outside had somehow crept in. The north wing's door was unlike the others in the castle. It was carved from black wood, streaked with veins of silver that caught what little light there was. The handle was shaped like a coiled serpent, its eyes small chips of garnet. When the traveler pressed the key into the lock, it turned with a sound that was less a click than a sigh, as though the door itself had been waiting. Beyond lay a stairwell spiraling downward. A draft came up from the darkness below and carried with it the scent of damp stone and something older, an almost sweet rot, like dried flowers kept too long. The traveler descended slowly. The steps were worn in the center, cupped by the passing of countless feet over countless years. Here and there, a torch burned in an iron bracket, but the flames were small and weak, and the shadows they cast shifted like living things. At the bottom was a corridor lined with doors. Some were chained shut. Some bore marks scratched into the wood, symbols the traveler did not recognize. The air was still, and yet the traveler had the strange sense that if they stood too long in one place, something behind the doors might begin to listen. They moved on until the hall ended in an archway. Beyond it was a chamber so large it seemed part of the earth itself. The floor was paved with stone, but the walls were bare rock, glistening with moisture. A single great table stood at the center, and upon it lay maps, dozens of them, all of the same region, but drawn in different centuries' styles. Mountains rose and fell in different shapes, rivers shifted courses, towns appeared and vanished from one map to the next. And in the corner, on a stand draped in black cloth, was a mirror. It was tall and oval, framed in gold that had tarnished to a deep brown. The travelers stepped toward it, but where their reflection should have been, there was only the room behind them, the table, the maps, the far wall of stone, but no figure in the foreground. And then, in that empty space, something moved. It was not them, not their shape, not their stance. It was a tall figure, cloaked in shadow, standing closer to the mirror than they were. The traveler turned sharply, but the chamber was empty. When they looked back, the mirror showed only the bare stone wall. That was when they heard the sound, not footsteps, but the faint scrape of something sharp against stone, somewhere deeper in the dark. The maps rustled, though there was no wind. The traveler realized then that the Count had not given them the key as a gift, but an invitation, or perhaps a test.
The scraping sound faded into the stillness, but the traveler's pulse did not slow. They moved carefully, scanning the edges of the chamber until they noticed something strange about the far wall. It wasn't bare stone at all. The wall was lined with small metal plates, each no larger than a hand. They were arranged in neat rows, from the floor to the height of a man, and each one was engraved with a single name. Some names were worn to near illegibility, the letters eaten away by time. Others looked freshly cut, the edges sharp, the grooves dark as if inked only yesterday. The traveler brushed their fingertips across one of the newer plates. It was warm. They stepped back and began to read. Some of the names were in Latin, some in Hungarian, some in tongues the traveler did not recognize. One, startlingly, was in English, a name from their own time, belonging to someone they had once read about in the newspapers. The air seemed to grow heavier the longer they looked. They could almost hear whispers, faint, fragmented syllables curling between the plates. In the center of the wall was a single plate, larger than the rest. No name was engraved there. Instead, the surface bore a mark, a stylized dragon, wings spread, its tail curling into a shape that looked half like a flame, half like a chain. It was the crest of the Order of the Dragon, the same order to which Vlad III, the man history would call Dracula, had sworn allegiance centuries ago.
Behind them, something shifted. The maps on the table rustled again, and this time one lifted slightly, as if invisible fingers had touched its edge. The traveler stepped closer and saw that this map was unlike the others. It was marked not with rivers and mountains, but with a web of red lines connecting dozens of small dots. Each dot bore a year, dates spanning more than 5 centuries. And every line seemed to lead toward the same place, the Carpathian Mountains. A soft voice, low and deliberate, broke the silence. "Every name is a debt," it said. "Every debt is paid in time." The traveler turned sharply, but the chamber appeared empty, and yet the mirror in the corner once again showed a tall, dark figure standing far closer than the traveler could bear. They did not remember crossing the room, yet somehow their hand was on the mirror's frame. The glass felt cold this time, cold enough to sting. The voice spoke again, though now it seemed to come from the traveler's own thoughts. "History is not written in ink. It is written in blood. My blood. Their blood. Yours." The mirror's surface rippled like water. The traveler's reflection began to appear, faint at first, then clearer,
But it was not them exactly. Their eyes were different, darker, older. A thin scar traced from the corner of the mouth to the jaw. And behind that altered self stood the Count. The traveler stumbled back, the mirror stilled, the reflection returned to normal. But when they looked again at the wall of plates, they saw something that made the breath catch in their throat. A new name had appeared in the very last row, their own.
The traveler could not move at first. Their name, gleaming faintly on the wall, seemed to pull the air from their lungs. They blinked hard, hoping it would fade. A trick of light, a slip of the mind, but it remained. The letters were cut deep, too deep to be erased. The voice returned, closer now, though still unseen. "Names are the first tether," it murmured. "Once written, the soul begins to lean toward me, and when the time comes, the body follows." The traveler turned toward the sound, but again the chamber appeared empty. Only the mirror, the wall of plates, and the table of maps. Yet the shadows in the corners seemed heavier now, almost layered, as though something stood just beyond sight, watching. From somewhere deep in the castle came the toll of a single bell. The sound was low and resonant, vibrating through the stone. It was not the cheerful peal of a church. It was slower, older, carrying with it a sense of reckoning. The traveler felt a faint pull toward the door. The corridor beyond was darker than before, the torchlight dim and flickering. Some instinct, or perhaps the same force that had brought them here, urged them forward. The passage wound deeper into the earth. Stone steps descended in a slow spiral, the air growing cooler and denser. With each step, the faint sound of voices grew stronger, a low murmur, rhythmic, like a chant. It was not in any language the traveler recognized, yet the meaning seemed to press against their mind. At last, the stairs ended in a pair of tall, iron-bound doors. They stood slightly ajar, and beyond them came the glow of candlelight, hundreds of flames, moving in restless waves. The traveler pushed the doors open. It was a hall unlike any they had seen before. The ceiling arched high overhead, vanishing into shadow. A long table stretched the length of the chamber, draped in black cloth and laden with silver goblets, polished plates, and dishes whose contents were hidden beneath dark lids. At the head of the table sat a tall figure in a cloak the color of deep wine. His face was partly in shadow, but the traveler knew him instantly. Count Dracula. The murmuring ceased. The candles flared. The Count rose slowly, and when he spoke, his voice filled every corner of the hall. "You have found the Chamber of Names," he said. "And so you are no longer merely a guest. You are remembered." He gestured to an empty chair near the center of the table. The traveler hesitated, but the weight of 100 silent eyes seemed to press them forward. Only then did they notice the others seated at the table. Some were richly dressed, others in the tattered garb of centuries past. A few faces seemed pale and drawn, their expressions vacant as though listening to a voice only they could hear. One man's attire was from the age of galleons. Another woman's gown was Tudor in cut. They did not speak. The Count's gaze never left the traveler. A servant, silent, faceless in the flickering light, placed a silver goblet before them. The liquid inside was dark and rich, catching the candlelight in deep crimson. The Count lifted his own goblet. "To memory," he said, "to the debt that binds us all." Every other figure raised their goblet in unison. The travelers' hands trembled as they lifted theirs. The surface of the drink seemed to ripple, and for a heartbeat, they could swear it reflected not their own face, but the Count's. The castle stood in shadow, its black stones drinking in the fading light. Far below, the Danube moved like a ribbon of molten silver through the valleys, its current carrying the whispers of centuries. Jonathan Harker, older now, quieter, stood at the threshold. The years had blurred the edges of memory, yet this place still breathed with the same ancient air. Somewhere beyond these walls, the history of Vlad Tepes and the legend of Dracula had tangled into something inseparable. Fact and story, truth and superstition, woven so tightly they could never be pulled apart. No battles raged here anymore. No flicker of torchlight in the courtyard, no echo of iron boots on stone. Only the wind sighed against the high towers, slipping through the narrow slits of the battlements. They said the Count was gone, but others claimed he was only sleeping, waiting. The land, after all, had seen rulers come and go, yet the mountains had learned the art of keeping secrets. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called once, then fell silent. The air held the cool weight of night. Harker turned from the view and began the slow walk down the mountain path. Behind him, the castle faded into the dark, becoming no more than a darker shape in the shadowed ridgeline. He thought of the peasants' tales, how sometimes, in the last light before dawn, a single figure could be seen upon the highest balcony, not moving, not speaking, only watching. Perhaps it was only a story, perhaps not. But tonight, as the mist curled up from the valley and the first stars pierced the sky, the legend of Dracula lay quietly in the mind, like a ship moored in still waters, like a candle burning low in an empty room. And in that stillness, the world seemed to pause, long enough for sleep to come and dreams to wander where history leaves no map.